No nation in the Old Testament appears more times than Egypt. It is where Abraham fled during famine, where Joseph was sold into slavery and rose to become the most powerful man on earth after Pharaoh, where Moses was born, raised in a palace, fled into the desert, and returned to perform the most dramatic series of divine judgments in the history of the world. Where the Exodus happened, the event that defined Israel's identity, shaped its theology, and became the template for every future act of divine redemption. But Egypt's story in the Bible does not end with the Exodus. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Nahum, returned to Egypt again and again, warning it, judging it, and, in one passage that most Christians have never read, making the most extraordinary promise about Egypt's ultimate future that appears anywhere in the prophetic literature. Isaiah 19:25. God calls Egypt my people, the same designation God gives to Israel, the same covenant language applied to Egypt, the nation that enslaved Israel for 400 years, the nation whose army was drowned in the Red Sea, the nation that became the symbol of bondage and oppression in the entire biblical narrative, my people. But what no one knew was that this extraordinary designation is not an accident or an anomaly. It is the culmination of a story that runs through the entire Old Testament, a story about a nation that was simultaneously the instrument of Israel's suffering and the location of God's most dramatic self-revelation. A nation that was judged more comprehensively than any other, and promised a restoration more beautiful than most people have ever considered. Welcome to Journey Bible Stories. Subscribe right now. Today we tell the complete Old Testament story of Egypt, and what we find will change how you understand the mercy of God forever. Let's begin. The story of Egypt in the Bible begins, as every nation's story begins, in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, the genealogical record of how the peoples of the earth descended from Noah's sons after the flood. Genesis 10:6, the sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Egypt, in Hebrew, Mizraim. The very name of Egypt in the Hebrew Bible is the name of Ham's second son. Mizraim, a dual form, suggesting the two lands of ancient Egypt, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, the two kingdoms that were united under the first pharaohs. Ham was Noah's second son, the one whose transgression against his father in Genesis 9 earned a curse on his son Canaan. The connection between Ham's line and the nations that would become Israel's primary oppressors, Egypt and Canaan, is embedded in the genealogical structure of Genesis 10. But what no one knew was the deeper irony of Egypt's origin. Mizraim was the son of Ham, who was the son of Noah. And Noah, the man who survived the flood, who received the covenant of the rainbow, who planted the first vineyard and became the first farmer of the new world, was the great-grandfather of the nation that would one day enslave the descendants of his son Shem through Abraham. The families of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were meant to fill and replenish the earth together, and instead their descendants would spend centuries in conflict, in oppression, and in the slow working out of a divine plan that would ultimately bring all three lines into a single redemptive story. Egypt's story does not begin with the Exodus. It begins in the Table of Nations, with a family, with the sons of Noah, with the God who knew, before any of them were born, exactly how their story would unfold and where it would end. Genesis 12:10-20. The first biblical encounter between the covenant people and Egypt, and it establishes a pattern that will repeat throughout the entire Old Testament. Famine in Canaan. Abraham, still called Abram, takes his family to Egypt to survive. Before entering, he instructs his wife Sarai, "You are a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me but keep you alive. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you." It is a plan motivated by fear, by the calculation that the Egyptians are people who would murder a husband to take his wife. And the calculation proves correct. Pharaoh's officials do notice Sarai. She is taken into Pharaoh's house, and Abraham is treated well for her sake. Sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male servants and female donkeys and camels. Abraham has exchanged his wife for livestock. Fear has produced a compromise that should have been unthinkable. And then God intervenes, not on Abraham's behalf, on Sarai's. Genesis 12:17, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Plagues. The first plagues in Egypt, not yet the 10 of Moses, but a foretaste. A divine intervention into Egyptian domestic life on behalf of a woman taken from a man who should have trusted God. But what no one knew was Pharaoh's response. He calls Abraham and says, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Here is your wife. Take her and go." The pagan king, the king whose nation will one day enslave Abraham's descendants, behaves more righteously in this moment than the patriarch. Pharaoh restores Sarai, sends them away with everything they have accumulated, and Abraham leaves Egypt richer than he entered. The first Egypt encounter, a pattern that will define the relationship for centuries. Famine drives Israel to Egypt. Egypt threatens the covenant family. God intervenes. Israel leaves with more than it came with. Genesis 37:50. The most extended narrative in the book of Genesis. The story of Joseph, 17 years old, son of Jacob, favorite of his father, dreamer of dreams, and his extraordinary journey from the pit to the palace. His brothers hate him. They throw him in a pit. They sell him to Ishmaelite traders for 20 pieces of silver. He's taken to Egypt, sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Everything Joseph touches prospers. Potiphar notices, puts him in charge of everything. Potiphar's wife notices, makes advances. Joseph refuses. She accuses him. He is thrown in prison. In prison, Joseph interprets dreams. The cupbearer and the baker. The cupbearer's dream means restoration. Tell Pharaoh about me. 2 years pass. The cupbearer forgets. Then Pharaoh dreams. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin cows. 7 plump ears of grain swallowed by 7 thin ears. None of Egypt's wise men can interpret. The cupbearer remembers. There is a young Hebrew in prison. Joseph is brought before Pharaoh. He interprets 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Appoint a wise man to oversee the gathering of grain during the years of plenty. And Pharaoh says, "Who is wiser than you? Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" The Spirit of God. A pagan Pharaoh recognizing the Spirit of God in a Hebrew slave, and appointing him as second in command over the most powerful nation on earth. But what no one knew was the theological architecture of Joseph's story. Every element of his suffering, the brothers' betrayal, the false accusation, the prison, the forgotten promise, was preparation. The pit was preparation for the palace. The prison was preparation for the power. The pain was preparation for the purpose. Genesis 50:20, Joseph's own theology of his suffering. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. God intended it for good. The Egyptian chapter of Joseph's story, every degradation, every injustice, every year of imprisonment, was God's instrument for saving many lives, including the lives of the very brothers who sold him. Egypt was the place of Joseph's greatest suffering and the place of his greatest purpose, both simultaneously, as it always is, with the God who works all things together for good. Genesis 15:13-14. God tells Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions." 400 years, predicted to Abraham, before a single member of his family had ever been to Egypt, before Joseph was born, before the famine, before the sale into slavery. God told Abraham, 400 years in a land that is not theirs. And it happened precisely. Genesis 46. The entire family of Jacob, 70 persons in total, comes to Egypt during the famine. Joseph provides for them. They settle in the land of Goshen, the fertile eastern delta region, and they multiply. Exodus 1:7. The people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. The promise to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, was being fulfilled in Egypt, in the land of slavery. The nation was being formed in the furnace of affliction. But Exodus 1:8, now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph, a new dynasty. The connection between Egypt and the Hebrew people, forged by Joseph's service, maintained by Pharaoh's gratitude, was severed. And the new king saw not a community of grateful sojourners, but a threat, a people too numerous to be safe, too powerful to be ignored. He put slave masters over them, forced labor, brickmaking, mortar, every hard service in the field. But the more they were afflicted, the more they multiplied. And the more they multiplied, the more Pharaoh feared them. And the more he feared them, the harder he drove them. And then, the final horror. Pharaoh commanded that every Hebrew boy born be thrown into the Nile. The nation that had prospered under Joseph, that had been fed during famine by the Hebrew prime minister, was drowning Hebrew infants in the river. The clock of Genesis 15:13 was running. The 400 years were accumulating. And in heaven, God was watching and remembering his covenant. Exodus 2, the birth of Moses, and one of the most extraordinary providential ironies in all of Scripture. Pharaoh has commanded that every Hebrew male infant be thrown into the Nile. A Hebrew woman, Jochebed, of the tribe of Levi, gives birth to a son. She sees that he is fine. The Hebrew suggests something extraordinary about the child, a divine quality that she perceives immediately. She hides him for 3 months. When she can hide him no longer, she does exactly what Pharaoh commanded. She puts her son in the Nile, but not drowned, placed in a waterproof basket among the reeds, and his sister Miriam watches from a distance. Pharaoh's daughter comes to the river to bathe. She sees the basket, opens it, sees the baby. He cries, and she has compassion on him. The deliverer of Israel, the man who will lead 2 million people out of Egyptian slavery, is rescued from the death Pharaoh ordered by Pharaoh's own daughter, and raised in Pharaoh's own household. Educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, trained in the most sophisticated military, administrative, and cultural system on earth. But what no one knew was the specific providence embedded in Moses' education. Acts 7:22. Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. The man who would confront Pharaoh needed to know how Pharaoh thought. The man who would lead a nation out of Egypt needed to know Egypt from the inside. The man who would organize millions of people in the wilderness needed the administrative training of the world's most efficient bureaucracy. God raised his deliverer inside the palace of the oppressor, fed him from the oppressor's table, educated him in the oppressor's schools, all so that when the moment came, Moses would be perfectly equipped to do what no one who had spent 40 years in slavery could have done. The Nile that was supposed to kill Moses carried him to his destiny. Exodus 7:12. The 10 plagues, the most comprehensive divine judgment in the entire Old Testament, and a judgment that was not random. It was systematic, targeted. Each plague was a direct assault on a specific Egyptian deity, a demonstration that the God of Israel was sovereign over every domain that Egypt's religious system had assigned to its gods. Blood, Exodus 7:14-25. The Nile turned to blood. The Nile was the source of all Egyptian life, agriculture, commerce, drinking water, and it was sacred. The god Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, was one of Egypt's most venerated deities. God turned their sacred river into death. Frogs, Exodus 8:1-15. Frogs from the river covering every surface of Egypt. The goddess Heket was depicted with a frog head, associated with fertility and childbirth. God multiplied the symbol of their fertility goddess until it became a curse. Gnats, Exodus 8:16-19. Dust turned to gnats. The earth god Geb, lord of the soil, could not prevent the dust of Egypt from becoming an instrument of torment. Flies, Exodus 8:20-32. Swarms of flies. The god Khepri, represented as a scarab beetle, the fly of the ancient world, was the deity of creation and rebirth. His creatures became instruments of destruction. Livestock disease, Exodus 9:1-7. The cattle of Egypt died. The bull god Apis was one of Egypt's most sacred deities. The sacred animals died. Boils, Exodus 9:8-12. Festering sores on every Egyptian. The god Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and disease, could not prevent or cure them. Hail, Exodus 9:13-35. Hail and fire mixed. Nut, the sky goddess, and Shu, the god of air, could not protect the sky. Locusts, Exodus 10:1-20. The god of crops, Nepri, could not prevent the destruction of the harvest. Darkness, Exodus 10:21-29. 3 days of complete darkness. Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon, extinguished. The god they worshipped above all others could not shine. Death of the firstborn, Exodus 12:29-30. The final plague. Pharaoh was considered the son of Ra, a divine being, and his firstborn son was the heir of divinity. God struck the firstborn of every Egyptian household, from Pharaoh's palace to the dungeon prisoner, demonstrating that there was no Egyptian deity with power to protect even the most sacred human life. But what no one knew was Exodus 12:12, God's own description of what the plagues were. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The plagues were not simply natural disasters or political pressure. They were a theological argument, delivered in 10 devastating chapters against every deity in the Egyptian pantheon. And the argument's conclusion was stated at the beginning. Exodus 7:5. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Exodus 12:14. The Passover, the departure, the Red Sea. The events that defined Israel's identity for every subsequent generation, and became the template for understanding salvation in both the Old and New Testaments. The Passover. God commands each household to take a lamb, without blemish, a year-old male, and slaughter it at twilight. The blood is to be placed on the doorposts and the lintel of each house. And when the Lord passes through to strike the Egyptians, when he sees the blood, he will pass over that door. The blood shall be a sign for you. A sign. The blood of a perfect lamb applied to the door, marking the household as protected from the judgment falling on Egypt. 1 Corinthians 5:7. Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. The Apostle Paul reading the Exodus story and seeing in it the clearest possible picture of the gospel. The lamb, the blood, the protection from judgment. The Passover. Not simply a historical event, but a prophetic picture, drawn in blood on doorposts in Egypt, of what Jesus would accomplish at Calvary 15 centuries later. The Red Sea, Exodus 14. Pharaoh changes his mind, pursues the Israelites with his army. The people are trapped, the sea in front, the Egyptian army behind. Moses stretches out his hand. The sea divides. Israel walks through on dry ground. The Egyptians follow, and the sea returns. The most powerful army on earth, the army of the greatest empire of the ancient world, drowned in a moment. But what no one knew was what Paul sees in the Red Sea crossing. 1 Corinthians 10:1-2. Our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Baptized. The crossing of the Red Sea. Israel passing through the waters of judgment while Egypt was destroyed by them is a picture of baptism, of death to the old life, of emergence into a new identity, of the power of God that brings his people through the waters of judgment unharmed. The Exodus is not simply history, it is theology, written in water and blood and fire and cloud for every generation that would follow. The Exodus did not end Egypt's significance in Israel's story. Throughout the period of the judges and the monarchy, Egypt continued to appear, sometimes as a threat, sometimes as a temptation, sometimes as an unexpected refuge, and always as a symbol of what Israel was not supposed to return to. Deuteronomy 17:16, when describing the future kings of Israel, God gives a specific prohibition. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Egypt was the world's primary supplier of horses and chariots, the military technology of the ancient world. The temptation for an Israelite king would be to build military power the Egyptian way, cavalry and chariots, rather than trusting in the Lord. The prohibition against returning to Egypt was a prohibition against trading the God of the Exodus for the military technology of the oppressor. 1 Kings 10:11. Solomon, in the height of his wisdom and prosperity, does exactly what was prohibited. He acquires horses from Egypt. He marries the daughter of Pharaoh. He brings Egyptian culture, Egyptian religion, Egyptian women into his court. And his Egyptian wives, among many others, turn his heart away from the Lord. The man who built the temple, who dedicated it with the most magnificent prayer in the Old Testament, ended his reign with his heart turned to the gods of Egypt and every other foreign nation his wives brought with them. But what no one knew was the specific warning embedded in Solomon's Egyptian marriage. Isaiah 31:1. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord. Going down to Egypt for help, the phrase that summarizes every generation's temptation to trust in human power, in military alliances, in the resources of the world, rather than in the God who parted the Red Sea. Egypt, in the biblical symbolic world, is the perpetual temptation, the place you go when you trust your own strength rather than God's. Hosea 11, one of the most tender passages in all of the prophetic literature, and one that uses Egypt as the backdrop for the most intimate expression of divine love in the Old Testament. Hosea 11:1-4. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. Out of Egypt I called my son. The Exodus reframed, not primarily as a demonstration of divine power, but as an act of parental love. God calling his child home, teaching him to walk, holding him by the arms, leading him with cords of kindness. Matthew 2:15. When Joseph and Mary flee to Egypt with the infant Jesus and then return, Matthew quotes Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt I called my son. The Exodus narrative applied to Jesus, the child who fled to Egypt and was called back, recapitulating Israel's story in his own body, living the national narrative in personal experience. But what no one knew was the full theological movement of Hosea 11. Despite Israel's unfaithfulness, despite the Baal worship, the idolatry, the repeated return to Egypt in spirit if not in body, God says in verse 8, "How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender. My heart recoils, my compassion grows warm and tender. The God who judged Egypt with 10 plagues, who drowned Pharaoh's army, is the same God whose heart recoils at the thought of abandoning his people, who says, "I cannot give you up. I will not hand you over." Egypt is the place he brought them from, and his love, the love that called them out of Egypt, is the love that refuses to let them go, even when they keep going back. Isaiah 19, the oracle concerning Egypt, 25 verses, and the most extraordinary range of prophetic content about Egypt in the entire Old Testament, from devastating judgment to breathtaking restoration. The judgment section, verses 117, God comes to Egypt on a swift cloud. The idols of Egypt tremble. The heart of Egypt melts within it. Civil war, Egyptian against Egyptian, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The Nile dries up. The reeds and rushes rot. The papyrus by the Nile withers. The fishermen mourn. The linen workers are in despair. And the wisdom of Egypt, the pride of the ancient world's intellectual tradition, fails. Isaiah 19:11-12. The princes of Zoan are utterly foolish. The wisest counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. How can you say to Pharaoh, "I am a son of the wise, a son of ancient kings"? Where then are your wise men? Egypt's greatest source of pride, its ancient wisdom tradition, its scribes and priests and advisors, rendered stupid and silent by the judgment of God. But then, the promise section, verses 18-25, and the transition is so abrupt, so dramatic, so unexpected, that it has puzzled commentators for centuries. In that day, there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the City of Destruction. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. And it will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, an altar in Egypt, a witness to the Lord in the land that enslaved his people. But what no one knew was what comes next, the verse that has stopped every reader who reaches it cold. Isaiah 19:24-25, the most extraordinary passage about Egypt in the entire Bible, and possibly the most unexpected verse in all of the Old Testament. In that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." Egypt, my people. Stop. Read it again. The nation that enslaved Israel for 400 years, the nation whose Pharaoh drowned Hebrew infants in the Nile, the nation whose army God drowned in the Red Sea, the nation that became the universal biblical symbol of oppression and bondage. My people, the same designation God uses for Israel throughout the covenant relationship, the intimate, personal, covenantal language of divine ownership and love. And Isaiah applies it by divine declaration to Egypt. Assyria, the work of my hands, the nation that destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, that scattered the 10 tribes. That became the model of brutal imperial conquest in the ancient Near East. The work of my hands, the language of creative affection, the language of a craftsman for what he has made. Israel, my inheritance, the covenant nation, the chosen people. 3 nations, 3 covenant designations: Egypt, my people; Assyria, my hands; Israel, my inheritance. All 3 receiving the blessing of the Lord of hosts simultaneously. But what no one knew was the theological revolution contained in this verse. The covenant framework that Israel assumed was exclusively theirs. The personal language of divine ownership and love extended to the nations that had oppressed them most severely, not because their history was forgotten, but because the God of the covenant is not only the God of Israel. He is the God of every nation he has made, and his redemptive purposes are not bounded by ethnicity, history, or deserving. Isaiah 19:25 is the Old Testament's clearest glimpse of what Paul will articulate in the New Testament. that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, that the middle wall of partition has been broken down, that all nations are summoned into the covenant family. Blessed be Egypt, my people. Jeremiah 46, the oracle against Egypt. Written in the context of the Babylonian conquest of the ancient Near East, the rise of Nebuchadnezzar as the dominant world power of the 6th century BC. Jeremiah 46:2, concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the river Euphrates at Carchemish, and which Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. The Battle of Carchemish, 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's decisive defeat of the Egyptian army at the Euphrates, the moment when Babylon replaced Egypt as the dominant power of the ancient Near East, and Jeremiah prophesied it. Jeremiah 46, 7-8. Who is this, rising like the Nile, like rivers whose waters surge? Egypt rises like the Nile, like rivers whose waters surge. He said, I will rise, I will cover the earth, I will destroy cities and their inhabitants. The confidence of Egypt, rising like the Nile, planning to cover the earth, to destroy cities, met the reality of the Babylonian army, and the confidence collapsed. But what no one knew was what Jeremiah says after the judgment. Jeremiah 46:26. Afterward, Egypt shall be inhabited as in the days of old, declares the Lord. Afterward, Egypt shall be inhabited as in the days of old. The same pattern we have seen throughout the Old Testament's treatment of Egypt. Judgment followed by restoration. Catastrophe followed by recovery. The wrath of God followed by the mercy of God. And then Jeremiah 46:27-28. Do not be afraid, O Jacob, my servant. Do not be dismayed, O Israel. For behold, I will save you from far away, and your offspring from the land of their captivity. Jacob shall return and have quiet and ease, and none shall make him afraid. The oracle about Egypt ends with comfort for Israel, as if the two stories, Egypt's judgment and Israel's restoration, are always told together, inseparable. Two chapters of the same divine story. Ezekiel 29-32. 4 separate oracles against Egypt, the most extended prophetic treatment of any single foreign nation in the entire book of Ezekiel, and they form one of the most detailed portraits of divine judgment in all of the prophetic literature. Ezekiel 29:3. God addresses Pharaoh directly. Behold, I am against you, Pharaoh king of Egypt, the great dragon that lies in the midst of his streams, who says, My Nile is my own, I made it for myself. The great dragon, Pharaoh described as a dragon, the crocodile of the Nile, the most fearsome creature of the Egyptian world, lying in the Nile, claiming ownership of the river. I made it for myself, the pride of Egypt, the assumption of divine self-sufficiency, the claim that the source of Egypt's life, the Nile, belongs to Egypt, that Egypt made itself, that Egypt needs no God. This is the specific offense that draws Ezekiel's most sustained prophetic attention, not simply political opposition to Israel, not simply historical oppression, the idolatry of self-sufficiency. The dragon's claim, I made the Nile for myself. Ezekiel 29:15. Egypt will be the most lowly of kingdoms and never again exalt itself above the nations. A specific prophecy, Egypt, once the greatest empire on earth, will never again rise to world dominance. Historically verifiable. After the Babylonian period, Egypt was conquered by Persia, then Alexander, then Rome, then Arab conquest, then Ottoman rule, then British colonialism. From the defeat at Carchemish in 605 BC, Egypt has never regained the world dominance it held in the era of the pharaohs. But what no one knew was the mercy embedded in even Ezekiel's harshest judgment. Ezekiel 29:13-14. Yet thus says the Lord God, At the end of 40 years I will gather the Egyptians from the peoples among whom they were scattered, and I will restore the fortunes of Egypt and bring them back to the land of Pathros, the land of their origin, and there they shall be a lowly kingdom. Gather, restore, bring back, even in the judgment, the language of restoration. No geographical feature in the entire Old Testament is more theologically loaded than the Nile. It appears in the story of Moses' birth and rescue, in the first plague, in the Exodus narrative, in the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and it functions as one of the most consistent theological symbols in the entire biblical relationship between God and Egypt. The Nile was Egypt. Without it, nothing in Egypt lived. The annual flooding of the Nile, depositing the rich silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible, was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. Every major Egyptian city was on the Nile. Every Egyptian religion was organized around it. The Nile was life, and God used it repeatedly as the instrument of his dealings with Egypt. The basket that carried Moses, placed in the Nile. The first plague, the Nile turned to blood. The second plague, frogs from the Nile. The Passover night, every firstborn in Egypt killed, while the Nile, normally the giver of life, could do nothing to protect them. Isaiah 19:5-8. The Nile will be dried up and parched, the reeds and rushes will rot, the papyrus by the Nile will wither, everything sown by the Nile will dry up, be driven away and be no more. The fishermen will mourn. But what no one knew was the specific theological message embedded in the Nile imagery throughout the prophets. The Nile was Egypt's substitute for God, the source of life that Egypt worshipped instead of the God who created all rivers. The dragon that lay in it, Pharaoh, claimed it as his own creation. And God repeatedly demonstrated that the Nile was his, not Pharaoh's, not Egypt's. The river that Egypt trusted for life, God could turn to blood, dry up, or use as an instrument of judgment at any moment. The Nile was Egypt's idol. And the God who judges idols always begins with the thing that is trusted most. Across the entire Old Testament and into the New, Egypt functions not only as a historical nation, but as a theological symbol, a consistent metaphor, a shorthand for a specific spiritual condition. Egypt represents bondage. The house of slavery. Exodus 22. The introduction to the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The defining description of Egypt is what it was to Israel, a house of slavery. Egypt represents the temptation to return, Numbers 11:5. The Israelites in the wilderness complaining, "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." The longing for Egypt, for the comforts of the slave house in the wilderness of freedom. The recurring human temptation to prefer the known bondage over the uncertain journey toward promise. Egypt represents trust in human power. Isaiah 31:1. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help. Going down to Egypt for military assistance, for horses, for chariots, trusting the military technology of the world rather than the power of God. And Egypt represents, in the New Testament, the world system that holds humanity in spiritual bondage before the true Exodus arrives. Revelation 11:8. The great city that is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. Jerusalem, in the moment of its greatest spiritual apostasy, when it has rejected and crucified the Messiah, is called spiritually Egypt, the place of bondage, the house of spiritual slavery. But what no one knew was the most personal application of the Egypt symbol. Every human heart has its Egypt. The bondage you returned to after you should have left, the comfort of the slave house that seemed preferable to the wilderness of trust, the horses and chariots you trusted when God seemed too slow. The Exodus is not just a historical event, It is the shape of every salvation. God calls his people out of Egypt, whatever Egypt looks like in their specific story, toward the land of promise. And the journey between them, the wilderness, the provision, the testing, is where he forms them into who they need to be. The Psalms return to Egypt repeatedly, not as a place of bondage to be escaped, but as evidence of God's power and faithfulness to be celebrated. The Exodus becomes the central reference point of Israel's praise. Psalm 78, a long historical psalm recounting Israel's journey from Egypt, the plagues, the Exodus, the wilderness wanderings. Verse 51, he struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the firstfruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. The language of judgment, precise, historical, unsparing. But Psalm 78 is not primarily about Egypt's punishment. It is about God's faithfulness to Israel, despite Israel's unfaithfulness. Egypt is the backdrop against which God's grace shines most clearly. Psalm 105, a celebration of the entire Abrahamic covenant narrative, from Abraham to the Exodus, verses 26-38, the plagues described in detail, blood and frogs and gnats and darkness and hail and locusts and the death of the firstborn. And then, verse 37, he brought out Israel with silver and gold, and there was none among his tribes who stumbled. None who stumbled. 2 million people, or whatever the actual number, and not one stumbled leaving Egypt. The God who organized the Exodus did not lose a single person on the way out. Psalm 136, the great psalm of thanksgiving. His steadfast love, chesed, endures forever, repeated 26 times. Among the reasons for thanksgiving, verse 10, to him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, for his steadfast love endures forever, and brought Israel out from among them, for his steadfast love endures forever. But what no one knew was the theological claim embedded in applying chesed, steadfast covenant love, to the judgment of Egypt's firstborn. The plague was not simply an act of power. It was an act of covenant faithfulness. God was being faithful to his promise to Abraham, I will judge the nation they serve. The judgment of Egypt was a love act toward Israel, and the God whose steadfast love endures forever, the God who judged Egypt, is the same God who said, "Blessed be Egypt, my people." His judgments and his mercies are both expressions of the same infinite love. Matthew 2:13-15. After the birth of Jesus, after the Magi visit, an angel appears to Joseph in a dream. Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Joseph rises that night, takes the child and his mother, flees to Egypt, and stays there until the death of Herod. Matthew 2:15, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Hosea 11:1. The Exodus verse, applied to Jesus, the child who flees to Egypt and is called back, living in his own body the story of the nation. Israel went to Egypt, Jesus went to Egypt, Israel was called out of Egypt, Jesus was called out of Egypt. But what no one knew was the full theological depth of this parallel. Jesus was not simply repeating Israel's history by accident or coincidence, he was fulfilling it. Where Israel failed in the wilderness, at every point of testing, grumbling instead of trusting, building golden calves instead of worshipping God, Jesus succeeded. He was baptized in the Jordan, Israel's crossing of the Jordan. He was tested in the wilderness 40 days, Israel's 40 years. He trusted at every point where Israel doubted. Jesus is the true Israel, the one who does what Israel failed to do, who lives the Exodus story perfectly, who comes out of Egypt not as a nation of grumblers, but as the obedient son, doing everything the Father commanded. And the Egypt that Jesus left, the political Egypt of Herod's shadow, gave way to the Egypt that ultimately must be redeemed. Isaiah 19's Egypt, the Egypt of my people, the Egypt where one day an altar will stand as a witness to the Lord. The child who fled Egypt will return as king, and Egypt, the place of bondage, and will be transformed into the place of worship. We have traveled from Ham's genealogy in Genesis 10 to Isaiah's extraordinary promise that Egypt will be called God's people. From the slavery of Exodus to the Passover, from the plagues to the Red Sea, from Solomon's compromises to Jeremiah's oracles, from Ezekiel's 4 judgments to the baby Jesus fleeing to the land of his ancestors' bondage. And now, the question that every story in Scripture ultimately asks: what does it mean for you? The story of Egypt in the Old Testament is a story about the extraordinary, relentless, unstoppable mercy of God. A mercy that pursues even the nation that most thoroughly represents judgment and bondage in the biblical narrative. A mercy that says, even to Pharaoh's land, even to the dragon in the Nile, even to the house of slavery, my steadfast love endures forever. But what no one knew was the specific personal application of Egypt's story. Every person has an Egypt, a place of bondage they left, or should have left, a house of slavery they keep being tempted to return to, a set of horses and chariots they trust when God's provision seems too slow. The Passover question, the question that the Exodus poses to every human heart, is simple. Is there blood on your doorpost? When the judgment passes through, the judgment that falls on every house not covered by the blood of the Lamb, will it pass over yours? Not because you are better, not because your Egypt was less serious than everyone else's, but because the Lamb was slain, the blood was applied. The death that should have fallen on you fell on him instead. 1 Corinthians 5:7, Christ, our Passover Lamb, has been sacrificed. And the miracle of Isaiah 19:25, blessed be Egypt, my people, is the miracle available to every person who was once the enemy of God, who once lived in the Egypt of sin and bondage, who has no claim on covenant relationship except the one provided by the blood of the Lamb. You are not too far from Egypt for God to call you out. You are not too deep in the Nile for the basket to hold you. You are not too much a child of Ham for the promise of Abraham to reach you. Out of Egypt he called his son, and he is still calling his people from every nation, including the one that most deserves his judgment, into his family, by grace, through blood, for glory. A nation that enslaved God's people for 400 years, a nation whose gods were humiliated by 10 plagues, a nation whose army was drowned in the Red Sea, a nation that became the universal symbol of bondage and oppression in the entire biblical narrative. And God looked at that nation and said, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, my people." That is the God of the Old Testament, not the distant, wrathful deity that caricature has made of him. The God whose steadfast love endures forever, even toward the dragon in the Nile, even toward the house of slavery, even toward the nation that threw Hebrew infants into the river. His mercy is not proportional to deserving, it is proportional to his own nature. And his nature, as he declared to Moses in Exodus 34:6-7, is abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Egypt will one day have an altar, a witness, 5 cities speaking the language of Canaan and swearing allegiance to the Lord of hosts. And the God who brought his son out of Egypt, who recapitulated the Exodus story in the body of Jesus, will bring his final and complete redemption to the land that first saw his power displayed in 10 devastating chapters of judgment. Out of Egypt I called my son, and he will call Egypt my people. That is the arc of the story. From bondage to blessing, from judgment to covenant, from the house of slavery to the family of God. Subscribe to Journey Bible Stories right now. Every week, the ancient word, the God who never changes, and the mercy that endures forever. Drop one word in the comments. What part of Egypt's story moved you most? Share this with someone who needs to know that no one is too far gone for the mercy that called Egypt my people. See you in the next one.